So a lot of people in the cybersecurity industry, compliance industry, talk about the CIA Triad. Now, of course, this doesn't mean the Central Intelligence Organization. That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about is three things: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The CIA Triad is referred to kind of in the biz as the cornerstone of security. This, from an organizational perspective, is what the purpose of cybersecurity is. Of course, you're managing risk, but how are you managing risk, and what are you trying to do? Confidentiality. Access to data is provided only to those who need the data. Integrity. The data is accurate and correct. And availability. The data is available to those who need it when they need it. Now, if you look at these three things, you can, and kind of look at them together, you can see that they potentially can be in tension with each other. So look at confidentiality and availability. Access provided only to those who need it. You're going to have to put restrictions on access. Availability, data is available to those who need it when they need it. The restrictions can't exceed the principle of availability. Similarly with integrity, the data is accurate and correct. Confidentiality, you're only going to provide data to those who need it. That means some portions of some databases might not be available to some people, but if they're not, then the data might not be totally accurate and totally correct. So the security function can't override the essential business functions for which the data is being used. Otherwise, security is kind of putting the cart before the horse, and you might be perfectly secure but have no business. So you have to really think about how all these things work together. All right, we also talk about the AAA Triad. Here, we're talking about authentication, authorization, and accountability. So authentication, the user can prove who he or she is. Authorization is the level of authority, the level of information that the user can access. And accountability means that there's some record of what was accessed and by whom it was accessed. So you can see how these things kind of go together. And I think you can get at least the beginning of a sense of how they relate to the CIA Triad. And I'm going to show you one more triad, and then I'll show you how the three triads actually work together. So the last triad is the PPT Triad. Here we have policy, procedure, and training. So policy, general statements of managerial intent. Our network will be secure from external intrusions. That would be a policy statement. Very broad, very general statement, and it states, what the intent of management is. Procedure, the detailed steps to implement policy. So policy, our network will be secure from external intrusions. Procedure, we will implement firewalls. And we will inventory all devices. We will implement firewalls. We will ensure that there is antivirus software. Those specific bullet points or numbered points or whatever you want to call them under the policy are the procedure. And then you would have more detail about how you're going to ensure that this virus software gets pushed out to all desktops and so on. Training is obvious, right? Communicating the policies and communicating the procedures to users. So this brings us to the triad of triads. I love these kinds of diagrams. So the foundation is the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Built upon that foundation are these other two triads of the AAA Triad: authentication, authorization, and accountability, and policy, procedure, and training. Now notice there's something at the very center of this pyramid structure, this triad of triads, which is the principle of least privilege. The principle of least privilege you can think of as kind of the fundamental principle that guides all of these three triads. And that fundamental principle is the notion that everyone can do everything they need to do and nothing more. Everyone can do everything they need to do and nothing more. So if you think about that phrase, I think you'll see how it relates to the ways in which we have to relate the different aspects of the CIA triad to each other. They relate to what the AAA Triad is trying to do, and they relate to the kinds of things that have to be implemented under the PPT Triad. All right, another set of principles. Now we've kind of set out sort of broad policy principles. Now we want to talk about what do we do specifically with respect to particular cybersecurity risks that we've identified. So as we look through the triad of triads, we said, one policy statement might be the network will be secured against external threats, external intrusions. Well, what are some principles that we might implement concerning that? And this is the PDR Triad of prevent, detect, and respond. And I think you'll see these principles, relate very much to the NIST framework. The NIST framework maybe puts a little more meat on these bones, but these general risk management principles are certainly incorporated and brought into the NIST framework. And you'll also see, I think, these are not specific to cybersecurity. I mean, these are general risk management principles that can be applied across kind of any spectrum of risk. Think about it. You're facing any kind of risk. You want to try and prevent the risk from occurring. If it does occur, you want to detect it, that it occurred. And if you do detect that it occurred, you want to respond to it. All right, so prevent. You want to prevent what can be prevented. Of course, not everything can be prevented. Risk management is not absolute risk mitigation. It's called risk management. It's called management because, for a wide spectrum of risks, the best you can do is try to manage them. You can't totally prevent them. There's just risk in this world, and if you're going to be out there doing anything and doing business, unless you're just going to totally shut down, you're going to face risk. So you want to prevent what can be prevented. You want to detect everything else, and the important thing here is everything, right? Prevent what can be prevented. Ideally, you want to detect everything else, any risk that is realized. You don't want it to go undetected. Now, this doesn't mean that it's true that everything can be detected, but the ideal, right, is to detect everything else and then respond to anything that is detected. So anything that is detected must be responded to in some way. Now, again, respond doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to totally repair or make up for the risk or totally recover from the risk. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but there has to be some kind of response. And critically for our discussion of risk management, there has to be some kind of plan for the response. So here are some principles that relate to these 3 points. Not everything can be prevented. You must try to detect everything. And then this last phrase that I learned in my training I really like: detection without response is useless. Detection without response is useless. If you might have a way of kind of logging and detecting when there are risks that have been realized, but if all you're doing is detecting and logging them, and you have no plan and no way of responding at all, then you haven't done anything. You've just wasted time.